moving on here, another very important issue, and that is the ongoing conflict in Yemen, which, some people are saying perhaps could be coming to a close, but we'll, I guess, find out about that when we talk to our next guest here, Shireen Al-Adeimi, who is a Yemeni-born anti-war activist and assistant professor at Michigan State University. Shireen, thank you so much for being back with us here on the show.
It's good to be back. Thank you.
Well, very honored to have you here. And I guess my first question, sort of mentioned in my introduction here, there's a lot of talk that peace is coming to Yemen. We're seeing handshakes happening, and all of these various pieces I think have given a lot of people hope around the world. Do you think we are headed in the right direction towards ending this conflict, or still too early to tell?
I think anytime warring parties sit down and talk to one another, this is obviously very positive. They're not dropping bombs on Yemen as they had been over the last 8 years. The Saudis are actually willing to sit down and negotiate. There has been a ceasefire agreement that, even though it broke down in October of last year, basically it's held. And for the past year, Yemenis have not had Saudi-led bombings and U.S.-backed bombings in Yemen. So this is all positive. The fact that the Saudi Arabian government is sending officials now into Sana'a, into Houthi-led territory, is really a major step. I mean, they have been calling them Iran-allied rebels for the past 8 years, and now they are seemingly recognizing their authority and the fact that they've been de facto rulers in Yemen over the last several years. The Houthis, of course, have been ruling Yemen, have set up a government and have set up armed resistance against the Saudi-led coalition over the last 8 years, and are de facto rulers. And so I think this is certainly a major step, but does it spell the end of the war? Of course not. The war is much more complex than that, but foreign intervention has been the biggest driver here. And I think any agreement that leads to an end to foreign intervention is absolutely positive and welcome.
Right. And of course, this is happening under the big shadow of the Saudi-Iran detente that was brokered by China, but also with the help of the Iraqis and the Omanis. And it is interesting to see how, I was actually looking today just to see what the Western press has been reporting about these current negotiations, which, as you said, are a really, really big deal. The fact that warring parties are sitting down together, the fact that Saudis have gone into Houthi territory to have a conversation. And what you see from a lot of these people at various Western-funded think tanks is, don't be so excited. This is not the end of the war. And they're right, it's not the end of the war, but it's almost like there's a bit of irritation. That this could be coming to an end. The irritation that, well, maybe the Chinese are going to get credit for this. And we can't really control everything Saudi Arabia does, but it does raise the question of, the importance of broader mediation efforts and rapprochement in the region between Saudi Arabia and Iran and other players, and how that impacts these sort of proxy conflicts in countries like Yemen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the U.S. maybe has tried to position itself as a mediator, and which cannot be farther from the truth, given that the U.S. has been an active participator in this war. They've actively supported the Saudi-led coalition, sold weapons, of course, but have also helped with targeting and logistics and training, and had fighters on the ground at the border. And so in every single way the U.S. has been involved in this war, they might as well be part of the Saudi-led coalition. And so they themselves cannot be thought of as mediators, even though, the Biden envoy to Yemen, Tim Lenderking, likes to position himself that way. Whereas China has not been involved in this war at all. And certainly Oman has not been involved. Oman is the only Gulf country that had not been involved at any point in time in this war, and has played a crucial role. And I think they don't get enough credit for the negotiating role that they have played since really 2016, where they've been holding various talks that, of course, broke down. But over the last year, we're seeing this successful, ceasefire agreement. And of course, the Saudis are exhausted. This war has been completely pointless. They've spent a lot of money for this, and they've essentially failed. They failed to recapture territory from the Houthis. They failed to reinstate President Hadi to power, and instead just set him aside and put a council of 8 men in his stead. But the Saudis essentially have been defeated in every way that counts, and Oman has played a role in negotiating a peace transition, and I think that's important. So yeah, it's not all about the U.S. It's certainly other countries have taken a positive role in this over the last few months and past year.
One other issue I'm curious about is the humanitarian situation. Of course, I think, Yemen has become famous, the world's worst humanitarian crisis, very dire situation. So even in the context of a ceasefire, where are we there in terms of, the average, life for Yemenis?
Well, that hasn't changed because the blockade hadn't been fully lifted, and it still has not been fully lifted. There are reports now that the Saudis have lifted the blockade over the southern ports, which of course should bring into question, why were they blockading the southern ports that they have controlled over the last 8 years anyway? So let alone what they've been doing and controlling in northern parts of Yemen, where over 80% of the population resides. And so the blockade has, and it's, not just fuel, but also food and medicine and whatnot. So they had been lifting those restrictions over the last year as part of the ceasefire agreement, but people are still starving. Yemenis still depend on trade, on imports. 90% of what comes into the country comes in through imports. This is before the war even. And so when you cut commercial trade, when you don't allow Yemenis to control their own waters and their own airspace and their own border, you have a situation where we have famine-like conditions in lots of parts of Yemen. And kids are still starving and people are still in need of medicine. And yes, there have been some flights, humanitarian flights and other flights that have been allowed now out to, out through Sana'a airport, but that's not enough. It doesn't meet the demands of the Yemeni population. And at the end of the day, when a foreign government is making these decisions, it tells you that the country is still under occupation. And so I think we have a long way to go to address the humanitarian suffering. We really absolutely need to make sure that there's no intervention, no foreign intervention whatsoever, whether that's the blockade or the supplying of weapons or the supplying of logistics and training and spare parts and maintenance like the U.S. continues to do, or the backing of various Yemeni forces on the ground. So when they set up this 8-person council, the Saudis and Emiratis continue to back various sides, and those fighters are vying for power on the ground in southern Yemen, but they're still funded and aided and trained by these Saudi or UAE groups, which have conflicting goals to begin with. So this coalition has been a mess to begin with. It's been a mess throughout these 8 years. And I think as long as they continue supporting various groups, Yemenis won't have a chance to sort this out for themselves.
It really does speak to just how much damage a war can do that's backed by outside forces using whatever sort of division lines exist within the country, and how it is fantastic when this stuff, starts to come to an end in terms of negotiations and peace deals. But then you have a really shattered country, shattered society. In the case of Yemen, you have the Southern Transitional Council, right? These secessionists in the south. You have where there's various militias exist. There's militias everywhere. You have the Houthi-controlled area. You have the areas in the sort of like Saudi-backed areas, where the internationally recognized government sits. And so once all is said and done, all we can do is sit here and speculate. But what are the sort of internal matters that Yemen is going to have to grapple with, right? Because it's not as simple as just the outside players end the war and go home and everything goes back to the way it was before. Everything's like super rosy and great.
Absolutely. So I would just remind people that, Yemen had been going through this tumult since 2011, since the Arab Spring, when when people started to peacefully protest the dictator. And eventually that led to, breakdown in communication, breakdown in efforts to reconcile the country, to bring about a democratic change. And President Hadi at the time, he was kind of put in charge of dealing with all of these various groups, and he failed tremendously. And that's when the Saudis intervened. But just before the Saudis intervened, in the 2 days before the Saudis intervened, in fact, Jamal bin Omar, who was the UN envoy to Yemen at the time, writes about reaching an agreement between all of these various groups, even after the Houthis had taken over the capital, Sana'a, even after they, forced Hadi into house arrest. They were still able to negotiate, to come together and to negotiate an agreement that worked for the different parties, the legislature and the executive. Agreement was reached, and then the Saudi, of course, derailed this process by just bombing, because they realized that they don't want the Houthis in power. They don't want whoever they want, whoever the Yemenis decide to be in power. They just wanted their own puppet government in power, or at least a very strong ally in power in Yemen, as they had been, enjoying for the last 30 years or so. And so I think that, this kind of speaks to the shifting dynamics in Yemen. At the end of the day, Yemen is a very tribal society, and tribes have to learn to live together. And we've seen alliances form and shift and break down and rearrange themselves. And I'm hopeful that, at the end of the day, they're pragmatic people who have to live together. And when it's just them deciding their own future, when, no one's blockading them or supporting this group or that group through trading and weapons and whatnot, then it's in their best interest to actually come up with an agreement that works for all of them. So yes, I think there's a long way to go before peace can be achieved, but it cannot be possibly achieved without foreign intervention, whereas the end of foreign intervention gives us hope that Yemenis could sit together and decide what's best for them.
Mm-hmm. Well, Shireen, we really appreciate you joining us as always and helping us sort through all of this and giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being here.